Welcome to American History, 1302, 1950s, a decade of duality. This is part two. If you have not seen part one, go find it. It's somewhere on the presentation. It'll be labeled part one. This is part two. Now, we're talking about post-war America, and the 1950s is a decade of duality. And our foreign policy was very, very pessimistic. It's very, very negative. But in our domestic policy, you'll see that in broad measure, it's very, very positive, very optimistic. So in that sense, the 1950s is a decade of duality. That is our thesis statement. 1950s, a decade of duality. In our foreign policy, very, very pessimistic. In our domestic policies and our domestic issues, very, very optimistic. So we're going to talk a little bit about domestic policy in terms of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. We're all scared, but then we're going to turn that around and talk about the very, very positive aspects which characterize most of America domestically in the immediate post-war era and right the way through to the 1960s. So with that in mind, let's move forward and talk about the Red Scare, and that is communism on the home front. The command-directed economy was working. They built dams. They built more factories. They were building more tractors. They were getting better agricultural productivity. The problem, of course, was that anybody that resisted even a little bit was shot. In other words, if you went to some guy that was like mining out coal or iron ore and said, okay, in the last year, the records show that you were moving, 10 tons a day. Well, in the next 5 years, you need to up that to 12 tons, 15 tons. And the worker would say, well, listen, I was working as hard as I could to get 10 tons a day. And now you're wanting 12 to 15 tons. And I'm not going to be able to do that. I can't do that. So they'd take a few of them out there and shoot them right in front of everybody else. And then the next person would say, okay, well, you know what? As it turns out, I can do 12 to 15 tons. And so back down in the mines they would go. And sure enough, 5 years later, they were working out 15 tons a day. Now, their demand was, listen, we got to have better food and we got to have better, clothing. So they would go to the food manufacturers and they'd say, listen, you got to produce more hogs, you got to produce more wheat, you got to produce more stuff. And they would say, well, no, we're not going to do that. So Stalin shot them, like 20,000 of them. 200,000 of them. Sent them off to the gulags. Killed them. But then the survivors would say, okay, well, we'll produce a lot more rather than be shot or gulagged. And then the tractor manufacturers go build more tractors. Okay, well, we're going to do that, but we want more stuff. Okay, you shoot a few of them, and the rest of them start building tractors. And if you continue to do that and brutalize your public, brutalize the workers, and terrorize them, after a while, it will start working because everybody knows that the Cheka, the KGB, they're out there and they will shoot you. They're ruthless. On the other hand, by the 1930s, everybody could see how that was actually going to work. And everybody starts producing more because they feel that that's the right thing to do. They can see it working. Dams were being built. More steel was being produced. Roads were being made. Locomotives were going all over the place. The economy was working. There was clothing. There was plenty of food. Well, in the West, intellectuals did not see the brutality. They only saw the results. And they said, okay, these 5-year plans, this command-directed economy, that's the way to go. So in short, there's a lot of people, intellectuals in the West in particular, that became ideologically communist. They said that we'll take the good parts and then get rid of the bad. Now the Soviet Union is going to recruit them. This is an in, and that's that first bullet point up there. They put these agents in all over the place. They said, okay, you're ideologically, you're Russian. Okay, you're Soviet. Fine, that's fine. Stay where you are. Keep doing what you're doing and keep your mouth shut. And when we need you, we'll contact you. Then the war came along. And the Soviets began to infiltrate. And they began to say, listen, you got to give us all the secrets. In the United States, Great Britain, we live in a free and open society. We do. And so the Russians found it easy to penetrate the United States, Canada, Great Britain, the Commonwealth. And go contact these people who had indicated that they were communists. And then tell them, listen, you got to start working for us. Well, 1945, 1950, the Warsaw Pact, China, Communist Party of the United States, they are all about expansionism. And we were terrified of that. In other words, somebody pointed out at the time, and they kept on saying it. Going into World War II, there were just about 120 million communists, and they were all in the Soviet Union, all of them. Or they were under control of the Soviet control in different countries, but they were tiny, tiny, microscopic little minorities. All the communists were in the Soviet Union. But by 1946, instead of 120 million or 220 million or however many there were billions of them because the Chinese had gone communist and Eastern Europe had gone communist. And all these communist parties were like cropping up all over the place. And we knew that they were being run by the Soviet Union, by Stalin. And so Americans became absolutely terrified that the communists were coming to get us. Then, and this is the big one, I want you guys to write a strong note here. On August 29th, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated a copycat version of the device that destroyed Nagasaki, Fat Man. Strong note here. We knew they were not doing their homework. We knew it. We knew that they did not have any kind of a nuclear program. So here they lit off one of these crazy bombs, and they hadn't done their homework. We knew it. Now, the icon of that is that guy in the middle photograph, Andrei Sakharov. And that's him in 1943. Andrei Sakharov was a renowned nuclear physicist. And our physicists knew him. And Andrei Sakharov knew, as a nuclear physicist, that there was a lot of potential in a nuclear weapon. He knew that just as well as our guys did. But Stalin was absolutely maltreating all the scientists in the Soviet Union. And they didn't have any kind of a technological beginning until well into the war, 1943, 1944. And the Soviet Union was like focusing all their time and attention on conventional equipment, bombers and tanks and jeeps and trucks. Their entire economy was based upon that. And so here's Andrei Sakharov, who understood the nuclear physics behind it because he's a physicist. But he kept sabotaging the program from within. He'd use the wrong formula, or he'd take the technology in the wrong direction, or, he'd forget to carry the one or something. But the Russians had an in. They had all these spies. So they detonated this copycat version of a U.S. bomb, and we knew that the only way they could be getting that was from spies. So our guys, especially the FBI, more about them in a minute, they started looking. And as it turns out, they started finding all these spies. HIST, he was in the State Department. And he was accused, but the evidence is against him actually being a spy. But he was in the State Department, and he had a lot of contacts in the Soviet Union. Well, it was part of his job to do that. On the other hand, Klaus Fuchs, who is over there on the lower right, that's him, Klaus Fuchs. Don't mispronounce it, please. We found out that he really was a Russian agent, and he'd been feeding nuclear secrets from the Manhattan Project to the Russians. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, they're up there in the upper right. Now, they were in the Manhattan Project. They were out there at the very, right there in the big fat middle of it. They were physicists, both of them. And Julius Rosenberg had been in the U.S. Army, and he'd been part of it. He's a scientist in the U.S. Army. He's part of J. Robert Oppenheimer's dream team that we talked about earlier. And they'd been feeding a lot of secrets to the Russians. So that is their photograph there on, where they're standing right next to each other. That's in kind of happier days out there in Los Alamos. The other photograph is their mugshots, because they got picked up by the FBI. Now, really quickly, HIST, he fought a legal battle to clear his name. Klaus Fuchs, we caught him red-handed. But later on, we're going to exchange him for American and British spies that the Russians had. There's a recent movie about that, The Bridge of Spies, I think it's called, with Tom Hanks. That's what it's about. We exchanged Klaus Fuchs for some of our guys. We got them back. But Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, I have to say, they kept saying, listen, we didn't feel that it was right that America had a monopoly on the bomb. We felt like the Russians had to have it too, as a balance of terror, balance of power sort of thing. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me be very clear on this. We gave them the electric chair, and we zapped them. 100,000 volts going right through them, and no switch better sent. So I'm telling you right now, giving Stalin the bomb, that was a bad, bad mistake. The unfortunate part, again, is it's a Red Scare. And this turns into a political drama called the Red Scare. And it's really, really bad, and it gets out of control very, very quickly. And so that's the last bullet point down there, and the next slide. Senator Joseph McCarthy gets control of this thing for his own reasons, and it begins to like dig at the Truman Administration. I've already talked about there were downsides to the Truman Administration. I said we were going to talk about this. Now we are. And that begins a big, giant investigation, and that is the next slide. So we're talking about McCarthyism and the Red Scare on the home front, the second Red Scare. Now, the Russians had lit off a nuclear bomb. We knew that they had not done their homework, and they hadn't. And Andrei Sakharov, who will be a big peacenik later on, he's going to be one of these guys that are going around saying, listen, we got to have peace, we got to have peace. He's going to be very big on that later on. Got the Nobel Prize for it. But McCarthy, I'm sorry to say, begins using this for his own political purposes. And he launches this big giant, I'm sorry to put this on the Republicans, but he's a Republican, and he's going to use this for his own reasons to get reelected. He was a senator from Wisconsin, and fine, I'm okay with that. And he's a Republican, and I'm okay with that. But he's also like had a lot of downsides. He had over-dramatized what he did in World War II. His little nickname was Tail Gunner Joe. He made sure he got photographed sometime or another with a whole bunch of like belts of ammunition all over him. You know, that he was an administration guy. And administration elements, they are important to the military as well. But he's going to make out like he was a combat guy and try to get elected. He did. It turns out he was also an alcoholic, and there was a lot of domestic abuse. So the good people of Wisconsin were going to unelect him, and he knew that. So he grabs a hold of this Red Scare thing, and he says, okay, I'm going to start investigating what's going on as a patriot. He just uses it for his own purposes. Very unfortunate. But everybody is so terrified about the communists coming to get us, and they're so terrified about the bomb, that they're like, okay, go get them. And McCarthy got reelected. But he kept on with this Red Scare. He kept ginning it up. Very famously, he got in front of a microphone and reached into his pocket, and he pulled out a little slip of paper, and he said, I have here in my pocket a list of over 50 names of people that are in the State Department that are working for the Soviet government, who are Russians, who are commies. And he put the list back in his pocket. Well, the list was not a list of names from the State Department. The list was a laundry list of stuff that he had to do before he got home that night. Because his wife knew he was going to be drunk. And so she said, do all these things before you come home. In other words, he was systematically deceiving the people and feeding upon their fears. And that's unfortunate. Now, as this continues on, he receives illegally information from illegal military and FBI sources. And that leads us to the guy up there, J. Edgar Hoover. Now, J. Edgar Hoover, I want to be clear on this. He is a dedicated professional. He is the chief law enforcement official in the United States. And he was dedicated to hunting down those commies, and he did. He hated communism. And he acted as a patriot for his country, and he did. Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs and all those guys that got caught, Klaus Fuchs and the rest of them, it's the FBI that caught them. They used good old-fashioned police work. He hated the mob, and he went after them, and he persecuted them, prosecuted them. He tried to stamp on them. He hated the Klan later on. He's going to hate on the Klan. He supported them for a while because he believed that they were out to get the communists as well, and they were. But he didn't like the domestic violence and the corruption that the Klan brought, which they did. And so he slams on them. So J. Edgar Hoover, you know, I'm not going to give him a pass, but we got to put this in the right context. So the FBI revealed a lot of information to McCarthy that they ought not to have done. It's unconstitutional. But McCarthy takes all that information and he just makes it all personal. And so that's the next one. Rhetoric, personal attacks, accusation, innuendo. And he's going to use this against other politicians. He's going to use it against, especially against Hollywood, actors, military men, and it becomes a witch hunt. Now, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you guys who don't know, the first thing you got to find in a witch hunt is a witch. In this case, we actually did have witches. Klaus Fuchs and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are a couple of good examples. So he's got a witch hunt, and he found some witches. And that means he can go searching everywhere. And the American populace was absolutely terrified that communists were behind every street corner. They were behind every tree. They were underneath every leaf of grass. They were everywhere. One of the dynamics, a big giant rumor that went on, even when I was a little kid, was that, the commies, they hang out in the men's room. They hang out in the boys' bathroom. So when you go to the boys' bathroom, don't go alone. There's got to be 2 or 3 of you that go to the boys' bathroom. Otherwise, the commies might be there, and they might whisper into your ear to be a commie while you're trying to pee-pee. It was crazy. It's the nature of a scare. But Eisenhower, who is a moderate, and we'll talk about him later, he sees where this is going. And as it turns out, McCarthy began to attack the Eisenhower administration. He was attacking the Democrats under Truman. And Eisenhower could kind of see that. And Truman was on his way out anyway. But when Eisenhower got in, McCarthy just put the heat on him. Here was this president who's a moderate, but he had conquered Europe and freed all of Europe and liberated all of them, a 5-star general. And McCarthy's going to have the temerity to go after him. Okay, so Eisenhower shut this down. Now, this all grows out of the House Committee on Un-American Practices. And that began in the 1930s, and it was a really low-keyed sort of, bureaucratic sort of committee, and that's all it was. It didn't do anything. But then it starts getting really, really powerful, and they start looking as well. To be clear, McCarthy was over in the Senate, and the House Committee on Un-American Activities, they were over there, the House on Un-American Activities, they were over there in the House of Representatives, and they started doing the same thing. So it indirectly supports the Klan. They add to these witch hunts. They begin blacklist on some of these producers and actors. Specifically, an actor that was on the blacklist was Orson Welles, Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin, he's going to be on the blacklist. Orson Welles, they put him on the blacklist. Some of these directors are going to run off to Europe, and they're going to say, well, listen, I'm just going to leave America. I'm never going to stay here. And they took off to overseas and didn't come back until the 1970s, 1980s. Peter Sellers, for a while, he was put on the list. There was very famously the Hollywood 10, and they were a bunch of producers, big shot producers, and they were brought before, they were subpoenaed by Congress, by the House Committee on Un-American Activities. They were subpoenaed. And they all said, listen, we're not going to show up. And if we show up, we're going to take the fifth. We're not going to say anything about anything. And we're not going to, we're going to speak out against this sort of witch hunt. And so they were blacklisted. And one of them ran off, Drexler, I think was his name. He ran off to Europe. Another one, unfortunately, finally caved in. And he implicated a lot of actors. He said, yeah, I think these actors are communist. Very famously, got another actor. Adolphe Menjot was his name. He's Belgian. And as it turns out, he was a Republican. But they got him and said, listen, if you don't rat out a whole bunch of these Hollywood actors, we're going to deport you back to Belgium. Well, Adolphe Menjot was a very famous actor at the time, and he was actually starting to act and make money. And so he had a lot at stake, and he said, okay, well, I'll rat out some of these actors. And he did, and he regretted it later. And this is really genuinely unfortunate. So this Red Scare gets completely out of hand. Now, as it turns out, Joe McCarthy, the alcoholism really started taking a toll on him. Late 1950s, he does get unelected. He basically ends up as a broken down guy, dead face down in the gutter, okay, and divorced and everything else. It was really, really bad for him. But this McCarthyism, it's part of the Red Scare, and it's just, how Americans felt about this fear. And that's what was going on overseas. You can see that from these posters. Communism is America's mortal enemy. And there's the hammer and sickle. And the Red Menace is real. Report all suspected communist activity. Again, don't go to the bathroom by yourself, because that's where the commies are at. So the Red Scare, that really, there's a lot of Americans that got hurt by that. So let's continue on with what's going on in America in the domestic arena. So let's talk about Eisenhower. Now we're in the broad picture here. Let's talk about Eisenhower. Again, 1952 is the election. We'd had Truman got reelected in 1948, so it's 1952. It's time for another election. Now, Dwight Eisenhower had retired out of the military. End of World War II, he's a 5-star general, can't go up any higher. He'd been in the military since World War I. And so after 40 years, he's like ready to retire. And he got a really good job as the president of Columbia University, right there in Washington, D.C. And as the president of Columbia University, he's in this educational setting. It's a whole different deal. It's kind of his retirement program. Well, in 1952, the Republicans, they just couldn't put together a good representative. They couldn't put together a good team. They hadn't been able to do that since Herbert Hoover. They're still paying a price for that. On the Democratic side, they'd always had a really good bunch of guys. They had FDR, and then they had Truman. Now, then they tried to put together, the Democrats had tried to come up with Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson, he just couldn't win. He didn't have the spark. He was kind of a balding guy, tall, slender. He had this little pencil mustache, and he just didn't have it. On the other hand, the Republicans go to Eisenhower, president of Columbia University, and they knew that he was a Republican. They knew he was a conservative. Strong note here. Eisenhower was a conservative. That is true. But he's middle, and just a tiny bit on the right. In other words, when you think of Eisenhower, don't be thinking of a Republican that we would understand today. He was a Republican at that time, and he's middle, and just a tiny little bit on the right. He's a Republican, but he's not a Republican who can get elected today. And he said that. He said, I'm not going to go for any kind of extreme policies. I'm going to go for the middle. And he did. So a couple of quotable quotes. Every gun that is made, every warship that is launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and those who are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. Another quotable quote, I have only one yardstick by which I test every major problem. And that yardstick is it good for America? He's going to do the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. And those are dynamics that everybody should be able to understand, even to this day. That's why I use those quotable quotes. He's got a lot of them. So the 1952 election, you can see on the map over there, Eisenhower versus Stevenson, and Eisenhower's going to carry all the United States except the Deep South. Now, all you need to know about the Deep South is they're so conservative that they don't understand that the Democratic Party has actually become the liberal party. That's how conservative they were. They can't bear the idea that the Democratic Party is not the conservative party. Now, the best that you can say about them is many of them are still benefiting from New Deal programs. But socially, they're very, very, very much on the right. You see the rise of the Klan. You see all this resistance to civil rights, and we'll talk about it later on in the 1960s. So Adlai Stevenson, a Democrat who is more or less a liberal, he's going to win in the South, only because he's on the Democratic ticket. But Eisenhower, who's a Republican, is going to win in places he never ought to have won as a Republican. But who's going to vote against Ike? I like Ike. So president from 1953 to 1961. Now, the first thing is he does trend towards isolationism. He'd been a soldier for all that time. He'd seen what war was like. He didn't want war. And he felt like, on some fundamental level, that if America's going to take control as planet Earth's policeman, then we're going to get involved in war after war after war. And one of the big secrets of the Pentagon to this very day, one of the big secrets of our military, is that most of the generals and admirals are actually doves. They like peace. They have a connection with the soldier, sailor, airman, and marine, and they don't want to see those guys get killed. That's the way it was then. That's the way it is now. And so he trends towards isolationism. On the other hand, we have membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. And these are treaty organizations that are military in their nature, but they're designed to halt communism. So while he's an isolationist on the one hand, he's also perfectly willing to go overseas and stop communism in his tracks. So you can see that he is a moderate. He's in the middle. The next bullet point there is the space race. In the late 1950s, the Russians are going to fire a rocket ship into space. And the first one had a dog, and then I think they had a monkey. But then a guy named Yuri Gagarin, he's going to get shot up there. Now the rocket reached orbit, but it did not execute an orbit. In other words, it was shot off in one part of the Soviet Union, got up into space, and then landed back in the Soviet Union. But then a year or two later, they shot Yuri Gagarin off, and he did make an orbit. And then they shot off a woman, and she made an orbit or two and landed back safely. And we did not have anything even remotely like that. So Eisenhower says, okay, this suggests that the Soviet Union is farther ahead technologically than we are in the United States. And he did not like that. Strong note here. Again, think democracy over dictatorship. The people of the United States of America said, listen, we're going to get into space. We want rockets too. We want guys up there. And so Eisenhower agreed with all that, and the American people certainly agreed with it. And so we invented the thing called the National Aeronautics Space Administration, NASA. We invented it, and we started putting together a space program. Kind of controversially, we're going to use a bunch of scientists that came out of Nazi Germany, especially Wernher von Braun. Now, von Braun, he made a strong case that the Nazis weren't using him as a rocket scientist. He was using them. In other words, he wanted to get a rocket. He wanted to get a man on the moon. And he'd always said that since he was a little kid. And so the Nazis put him in charge of this rocket program, which turned out to be the V2. And he wanted to build the rockets, but he kept kind of tripping it up so that it wouldn't like deliver to a bomb to a city. But there were enough dedicated Nazis to actually like make that work. Anyway, after the war, we grabbed Wernher von Braun and we brought him to the United States and said, okay, teach us about this rocket technology. Maybe we can use that. And that rocked along for a while. In other words, the Soviet Union, they got all the hardware. They couldn't stand the scientists. They hated them. We just shot them. So they took all the hardware and they took a lot of the documents. But we took all the brain power. We said, we don't need the hardware. We don't need the documents. We want the guys that thought it up. If they thought it up once, they could think it up again. And so we grabbed all the right people, and that was the right idea. Under any circumstances, we began a space race, Brinksmanship, and the Korean War quickly. Eisenhower famously said when he took office, I shall go to Korea. And that sent a message to the communist Chinese that the guy who had defeated the Nazis was coming over there to end that war. And as it turns out, this worked perfectly because the Chinese started to negotiate for real, like right away. And it did bring the war to a halt, the Korean War. Now, as a part of policy containment and the domino theory, I want to introduce you to the next phrase, and that's MAD. MAD stands for mutually assured destruction. MAD stands for mutually assured destruction. So the way MAD works, strong note here, our policy became, if the Soviet Union, who by then had the bomb, uses nuclear weapons against the United States or any of our allies, then it is as though they use the nuclear bomb against the United States itself. And we will respond with everything we got. If the Soviet Union or any of their allies used a nuclear bomb against the United States or any of our allies, it's as though they used the atomic bomb against the United States itself. And we will respond with everything we have. We won't hold anything in reserve. Take a look at that picture there in the upper right. That is a live shot of a nuclear detonation. And that's the kind of stuff that we were doing. The bombs had grown dramatically, and we were talking about using everything we had. And that is massive retaliation. Massive retaliation. Use every bomb by rocket, by submarine-launched rockets, by bombers. Every bomb we got. Nuke them and nuke them and nuke them until you can't nuke them anymore. Now, the Russians were going to do the same thing to us. The Russians had a similar policy. They still do. And I cannot overemphasize this, ladies and gentlemen. Mutually assured destruction is our policy today. Typically, we don't have politicians that are willing to say that publicly, but that is our policy today. If the Russians, or as it turns out, the Chinese, use a nuclear bomb against us or any of our allies, then we'll bomb them with everything we got. We won't hold anything in reserve. We'll bomb them until they're all dead, and they'll bomb us until we're all dead. That's what mutually assured destruction means. That's what massive retaliation is all about. Now, the next one is the U2 incidents. Now, U2 has nothing to do with an Irish musical group. It has nothing to do with Bono. A U2 is a type of aircraft, a spy aircraft. Strong note here so you don't miss the context. U2 is a type of spy aircraft. We still use them. And this is in an era before satellites. There were no satellites up there. Even when there were satellites up there, for years and years and years and years and years, they didn't have photographic equipment that would work properly. We just didn't have that. That is a late 20th, early 21st century thing. So if we wanted to find out what was going on in Russia, we had to actually take pictures of it, and we needed an aircraft to do that, and that was the U-2. It would fly at extreme altitude, near space, 85, 90,000 feet up, really, really high up, and it had high-resolution cameras, and it could fly over the target, take all these pictures, and then fly back. And so you could have the photographs from the time it's taken to the time it gets into somebody's hands within a couple hours. The other thing that's important about U-2 is it flew above any kind of rocket, anti-aircraft rocket that the Russians had. So with that in mind, May 1st, 1960, which is really kind of the exclamation point at the end of the 1950s, but it's part of the Eisenhower administration. In other words, it'll lead straight into Kennedy and when he has to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. A U-2 flown by a guy named Francis Gary Powers was flying over the Soviet Union. And it was brought down. Now, what's important about this is that Eisenhower had been saying that we had no aircraft doing that. The Russians had been screaming their heads off, saying, stop flying over our airspace, stop doing that, stop doing that. And Eisenhower had kept saying, we don't have aircraft that do that. It's all fake. The Russians are trying to, lie. Well, it turns out that Francis Gary Powers, his aircraft were brought down. Sidebar, there's a lot of controversy about this. I'm not big on conspiracy theories, but I have to say there's a lot going on here, a lot of moving parts. In other words, the Russians are saying, yeah, we shot it down. But if you take a look at it, and you can Google it anytime you want, the aircraft crash landed, but it's all in one piece. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're at 80,000 feet and you get hit by a rocket, the aircraft is going to disintegrate. It's going to come down in little bitty bitsy pieces. So it's my position that it experienced some sort of mechanical problem or engine failure. It had a very high-tech engine, and I suspect that it had an engine failure. And so the aircraft landed more or less intact. More importantly, Francis Gary Powers was supposed to take a cyanide tablet. But he said on his way out of the airplane, he got sucked out of the airplane trying to bail out, and it knocked him unconscious. And the parachute opened on an automatic basis. So when he hit, he didn't have a chance to take the cyanide tablet. Under any circumstances, the Russians captured him and put him on trial. And he just told the truth. He said, yep, I was in a spy plane. I took all these pictures. And the plane got shot down or whatever. And you guys got me. I'm a spy. Strong note here. What's important about U-2 is that the Russians were making all kinds of military claims. And U-2 showed that they were a bluff. And so our side could relax. What's really important about U-2 is not Francis Gary Powers or the fact that it made Eisenhower look foolish. It didn't. Everybody understood that Ike had to keep that a secret. He had to deceive the American public to protect the secret, and everybody understood that. What's important about U-2 is that the photographs that they were taking showed that the Russians were bluffing about their capabilities. They were overstating what they were able to do. And the photographs revealed that, and therefore the United States could calm down. Our military guys could back up. They could calm down. So U-2, on the surface, looks like a bad idea. Nope, it's a brilliant idea. Last but not least on this particular slide, Eisenhower will admit Alaska and Hawaii, and that will lead us up to 50 states in the Union. So Eisenhower, 2 terms. By that time, we had a constitutional amendment that said a president can only go 2 terms. On his way out the door, Eisenhower said very famously, watch out for the military-industrial complex, but a quotable quote is, a president should not be above the age of 70. And he's speaking from experience. And so, I don't know. That kind of resonates in this day and age. Under any circumstances, let's go on to the next slide. And I'm not going to have a whole lot to say on that because I'm trying to get done with 1950s Part 2. But I want you guys to be thinking big when we go to the next slide. Now, what I want you guys to be thinking about here is the actual practical application of nuclear proliferation. There's a specific kind of missile called an ICBM. Write this down. You'll need it in the 1960s. ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. ICBM, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. That means you can light one of these crazy missiles off, and you can see that map of the Soviet Union there, that big red blob, that's the Soviet Union. And all those little black dots, those are missile bases. They're all over the place. And you can light one of those crazy things off there, it will fly over the North Pole and land in America. But you can see in the map down in the lower center, you can see those big black patches. Those are missile fields here in America, and they're still there. Minot Air Force Base and some of these other ones, Barksdale Air Force Base, those are missile bases. And if you go there, they're big giant fields, and they're full of missile silos. And inside all those silos are missiles. Plus, we had bombers, and the Russians had bombers. Now, listen to me carefully. One of our operations is going to be, just as an example, is going to be called Operation Looking Glass. Now, Operation Looking Glass means you take a big giant bomber, a specific type called a B-52, and you have that thing flying up over there. Take a look at the map of the lower right, called the DEW line. DEW stands for Defense Early Warning. And it's a whole bunch of radar bases up there in the Arctic Circle. And you have all these bombers up there flying over the DEW line in big, gigantic figure eights. They take off from America, fly over Canada, circle around up there on the DEW line in big, giant figure eights, just flying in big, giant figure eights. They'll get a mid-air refueling. They'll stay up there on station for about 24 hours in the air. And then that shift will end, and they'll start flying back to America. At the same time, a whole bunch of other B-52s are flying up there to the DEW line. And then they'll stay up there for 24 hours. And then they'll fly back, and a third shift will fly up there. And then the third shift will fly back, and the first shift is up again. Plus a bunch of KC-135 super tankers, air tankers for mid-air refueling. And a whole bunch of fighters to provide air support. So how many bombers do we got to build? Thousands of them. How many KC-135 fuelers do we got to build? Thousands of them. How many fighters do we got to build? Thousands of them. How many Air Force bases do we got to build? Thousands of them. How many silos have we got to build to put a missile in there? With what's called a MIRV, a multiple independently targeted reentry vehicle. That's a MIRV. And those are nuclear bombs inside of a missile. There'll be like 15 or 20 of them, and they'll release at different times along the trajectory and hit different targets. How many guys does that take? How many scientists? How many engineers? And what do they all do with the money they make? They spend it. How many guys over at Boeing and McDonnell Douglas making all these bombers and all these fuelers and all these fighter planes? How many of them are over there? How many guys over at Boeing, as it turns out, and several other companies making all these missiles and then putting them down the silos? And what do they all do with the money they make? They spend it. And somebody's going to be there to meet their demand. And what are those people going to do with the money they make? They spend it. Operation Looking Glass is going to start in 1956 and is going to run until 1989. How many millions of air hours is that? How many bombers? How many tankers? How many pilots? The DEW line is a whole bunch of radar stations. Manned radar stations. Back in those days, the big joke in the Air Force who ran those radar stations was that if you do something wrong, they're going to send you to basically Siberia. You're going to go up there to the DEW line. You got to spend a year on station. And so it just went on and on and on. Billions and billions and billions of dollars. Later on, the Navy's going to get in the game, and they're going to have these nuclear submarines that have nuclear-armed missiles on them. The Army wanted to get in the game, but it just never did work out for the Army. But all this is like billions and billions and billions of dollars that we're spending on national defense. And what's the reason why? Everybody's scared, which is the next slide. Now, this is what's going on. This detonation is called Castle Bravo. Look it up. I'm only going to spend like less than a minute on this slide. What you're seeing here is 15 megaton nominal yield. A gigantic detonation. The cloud top topped out at space. In other words, it went to the top of the atmosphere. And we're testing all these bombs and testing them and testing them and testing them. And Castle Bravo was a big one. A lot of things went wrong with it, but then it turned out to just make a bigger explosion. Also, I have a new development for me. I'm trying to learn all the time. There is a link to a YouTube. You're watching this on YouTube. I'm morally convinced that if you click on the link, it will take you to a 1-minute video that should, I hope, show you the biggest surface detonation atmospheric test on planet Earth. It's called the Tsar Bomb. It's a 50 megaton nominal yield. Feel free to watch it. Remember that you can't unwatch it. But that's what was scaring everybody to death. That's why we're doing so much with our foreign policy. That's why we're building all these bombers and all these bombs. Because if the Russians were doing it, they were doing it for sure. And if they had to do it, we had to do it. And all it takes is one idiot to make a mistake, and we all die. Even the cockroaches die. They all die. Everybody dies. Nobody lives. So everybody's thoroughly terrified. Click on the link. Take a look at what you see there. and decide if you wanted to try and, you wanted to see one of those things going off. But with that in mind, let's go on to some more positive things. Now, what we're talking about here is domestic policy. And again, I've spent a lot of time and effort, probably about 2 hours, scaring the crap out of you because them evil Russians are coming to get us. But now let's talk about some of the positives. And I'm going to use this through a series of examples, which are the next 3 slides. So let's talk about post-war America. And in our domestic policy, we're very, very optimistic. And a good example of that is Levittown. So it turned out that there was a housing developer. His name was Levitt. Don't worry about that. But he saw that there was going to be a need for homes. All these servicemen returning from overseas, we got out of the 1930s into the 1940s. All these guys went into the military. They went all over the world beating those crazy Nazis, those evil Japanese. And then they're going to come back to America. And they're not going to want to move back in and, be in mom's basement. They're going to want their own home. Sort of what they call, not necessarily a nuclear family, as in a nuclear bomb family, but a nuclear family that you see in the lower right. A husband, a wife, 3 kids. And they're going to want their own little home. So this developer, this Levitt character, he went into upstate New York a little ways, right outside of New York City, and he said, okay, I'm going to buy a bunch of farmland, which is what you see here. Nice and flat, unexciting, and cheap. Please write that down. He bought a bunch of farmland. It was cheap. There's nothing there except farms. It's nice and flat, had a highway that happened to be going by there. It's unimproved land other than it's like farm, and it was cheap, 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 cheap. Then he got some designers, and that's that kind of photograph that you see in the middle of the slide there. And he said, I want you guys to come up with 4 designs, A, B, C, and D, for different floor plans. This many square feet in the house, but different floor plans. Put the front door over here, turn it around on the plot, do whatever you're going to do. Then he went to the architects and said, listen, I want you to lay out a city, and that's the city that you see there in the upper right. But he said, build in a bunch of curves, cul-de-sacs. Make it interesting, not a bunch of straight streets on a grid. That's not what he wanted. Then he also said, put in a schools, put in a shopping center, put in places for churches, a community center, put some place in there for, the mayor and city government. Then go to all those houses, paint them different colors, give them different features. All basically the same amount of cubic feet, square feet, but just different features, A, B, C, and D. Now, let's say that there's 1,000 houses in that Levittown, which is what you see up there in the upper right. And it turns out there's about 1,000 houses there. Well, that means that 250 are going to be A, 250 B, 250 C, and 250 D. But what I'm driving at, what I want you guys to write down is, think of the production. This streamlines production. In other words, you get one construction team and say, you guys are only going to build A's. So build them really fast on the plot, and you know exactly what dimensions, you know exactly where the windows go. You can streamline the doors, the sinks, the bathtubs, everything. You streamline it all. Then you guys are going to be the B's, and you can streamline everything because you know exactly how B goes. And you guys are the C's, you guys are the D's. Then on each street, and you can see that right here in front of you, he said mix up the A's, B's, C's, and D's in a random pattern. Put them in different places on the plots in a random way. Some are going to have a bigger front yard. Some are going to have a smaller front yard. Some have a bigger backyard. Some are a smaller backyard. Some on this side of the plot. Some on the other side of the plot. So that the houses don't look identical. It gives you the illusion that every house is unique unto itself. Paint them different colors, which is what you see. But the key here is that the houses themselves are inexpensive. You've got inexpensive land. You built them in a streamlined pattern. And so the houses themselves are inexpensive. And that's exactly what every serviceman wanted. A house, put in a television, more about that later, and a refrigerator. A nice bed, a nice little place for the carport. You got a nice little house there. Cool little home. Go out there and marry the girl of your dreams. Start having kids. They're going to go to the school right down the street. You got your own shopping center, your own church. You got everything that you need right there. And it's all really inexpensive. Then you're going to go out and get a car. Talk about that in a minute. You go get an education. They have this thing that Congress came up with called the GI Bill. I used it. If you are a taxpayer, you are. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Because I used like $150,000 of GI Bill to go to college to get an education, and you guys are enjoying that right now. I'm trying to pay that back. The GIs coming back from overseas could go get a great education and anything they wanted, and they could apply that to the United States. And then go out and get that really good job. They can go out and get that home and start filling it with all sorts of consumer goods. And they're going to go get a good job. Strong note here. Strong note here. Would anybody do that if they thought they were going to die in a nuclear holocaust tomorrow? Would anybody go out and buy a house, get a car, invest in an education, go get a wife and, start having kids? If you thought, tomorrow I shall die, tomorrow's my last day, nobody would do that. Nobody would make that investment. But instead, everybody felt very optimistic. We just won World War II. We beat those crazy Nazis and those evil Japanese. We beat them. The sky is blue. I got a great job. I'm making really good money. I married the girl of my dream. When I got a house, it didn't cost me much money. I got a car. I'm going to get a great education. Everything is going really, really well. And everybody felt very, very good about it. So they're willing, ready, and able to make this investment because the sun will come up tomorrow. So when we talk about our foreign policy being very, very pessimistic, okay, but that is this decade of duality. In our domestic, we're very, very optimistic. Furthermore, think. The Marshall Plan is sending lots and lots of stuff over to Europe. And those Americans who are building that stuff and sending it off to Europe, we're the ones that are shipping it. How many people that put to work? Millions. Making really great money. Then we pour a lot of time and effort and money into a space race. How many people that put back to work? Millions. And what do they do with the money they made? Then you've got guys building big giant subdivisions like this, construction people. And what do they do with the money they make? Then you got all these GIs coming back from overseas. They're getting their old jobs back, kicking women out of the workforce, which is unfortunate. But then they get a really great job, and what do they do with the money they made? They bought all sorts of consumer goods, a refrigerator, a TV. They got air conditioning, they got a house, a car. And somebody was there to supply that, to build that stuff. The United States was an exporting nation in a big way in the 1950s, not an importing nation hardly at all. In other words, in the 1950s, was anybody going to buy a Japanese car, a Japanese radio, a Japanese camera? What? No. Was anybody going to buy a Mercedes? No. Was anybody going to buy a Volkswagen? They weren't really producing them. The Japanese were not producing them, and the Germans were not producing them anyway. But nobody was going to buy that stuff. No one. It was out of the question. So all the cars, all the motorcycles, all the radios, it's all American made. Every bit of it. How many people got put back to work? And what do they all do with the money they made? So what's happening to the economy? It's going off like a Roman candle. And people are reinvesting basically in themselves. Consumerism is not dead, it's alive. It got a rebirth. Think of the situation in the 1930s. Nobody spent any money. Nobody had any money, and everybody was traumatized by that. Then in World War II, you couldn't spend money. You could only build bombers and tanks and jeeps and trucks. The entire economy was dedicated to the war effort. So now it's the 1950s, and the war is over, and all of our boys came home, one way or another. And so, America went crazy. And is that optimistic or pessimistic? It's very, very optimistic. So think of Levittown as this example of this optimism. Nobody would have bought this house and then filled it with consumer goods and went out and, found yourself a wife and started having kids if you thought you were going to die tomorrow. Everybody knew the sun was going to come up. It was going to be wonderful. Now let's continue that dynamic in the next slide with a new development. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the 1950s, a new development. Now it's not an invention, but it's going to be called the television. Now the invention is called the Cathode Ray Tube. This is technological. It's called the Cathode Ray Tube. And that picture in the upper left, where I usually start, that's called a Cathode Ray Tube television, a CRT. Most of you guys have never seen one. You're used to having flat panels. I'm looking up the TV right now, and it's a flat panel. I'm looking at my computer screen, it's a flat panel. That is a new development, really new. But the CRT, Cathode Ray Tube, that was developed just before World War II. Strong note now, so you understand the context. It was developed in England just before World War II. The idea of television was developed in England just before the war. But then the war came along. And what we needed more than we needed televisions by far was radar screens. And the CRT, the Cathode Ray Tube, was perfect for radar screens. And so rather than building and develop television, we took the Cathode Ray Tube and made radar monitors, the radar screens. And we miniaturized them and made them better, and we made lots and lots and lots of them. In other words, the British gave the Cathode Ray Tube technology to the Americans, and we started making radars by the millions. And our guys improved upon them and made them less expensive and made them better and better and better. So the resolution was better and better and better. And they were smaller and smaller and smaller and less and less and less expensive. But then the war came to an end. And we didn't need all those radars. Or if we needed radars, we're going to go with a different technology on that. But that's a separate issue. And so somebody said, let's revisit this idea of television. So, everybody wants a television. Strong note here. Because if you miss this part, then none of the rest of this makes any sense. The television signal has to go out over the air. Like radio has to go out over the air. Like Wi-Fi has to go over the air. Now you think that's very fundamental, and it is. But the airspace is owned by the people of the United States of America. And so CBS, NBC, later on ABC, they have to pay a royalty to use that airspace. It's microscopically small. But in order to broadcast, they have to pay a royalty. And it's really, really small, or very, very small. What's important here is that gave the American people, through the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, a say in what was being transmitted. Now with radio, it's always going to be, music basically and news. But television is a different medium. It's visual as well as audio. And so we had to make a decision. Strong note now. Our decision was, are we going to use television for education? Now this is a programming decision that had to be made. And everybody got involved in it. And I want you guys to think about that, using television as the dynamic for education. Think of a channel that's going to be the language channel. And you turn it on at this time and it's Japanese. And another time it's French. Another time it's going to be German, Russian, whatever, Spanish. Or the math channel. And you turn it on, it's going to be algebra, or it's going to be basic math, or it's going to be this or the other. And you're going to have professors out there and they're going to be talking about this. And they're going to be telling you about math and physics, geometry, algebra. I don't think they're going to have a big fan base, but maybe. And on and on and on with that dynamic. Or is programming going to be about entertainment? And the decision was made, it's going to be about entertainment. Entertainment won. Okay, fine. So then that depends upon programming. Strong note here. I'm going someplace with this. You guys got to follow along. You got to follow. So what's programming going to be like? And I have some programs up there. There's Howdy Doody and Buffalo Bob. Uncle Milty, that's Milton Berle. I'll talk about him in a minute. Jack Webb, the Lone Ranger. There's Rod Serling. Some people misspell it as Rod Sterling. No, it's Rod Serling. Twilight Zone, as it turns out, it's on TV right now. I Love Lucy, The Phil Silver Show, Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, Danny Kaye, Dick Van Dyke, Dragnet. The list goes on and on and on. Strong note here. Strong note here. What characterizes all of these programs is that all of your problems are going to be solved in about 30 minutes. All your problems are going to be solved in 30 minutes. 30 minutes or less, problems are solved. Let's talk about Dragnet for a moment. Now, Dragnet had this really impressive music as a lead-in. I remember it in my head right now. I'm not going to sing it to you, but it had this really, really impressive music as a lead-in. And you always knew Dragnet was on because of that. Then this voice would come on and it said, the stories you're about to see are true, but the names have been changed to protect the innocent. And then this music would cut back on. And then Jack Webb would be on there. He was the icon of this police drama. And some lady would be out there screaming her head off, something bad happened, and Jack Webb would show up. He would be there, Joe Friday or whatever his name was, and he would say, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And in 30 minutes, the crime would be solved. Now that has a modern ancestor, if you will. That has a modern program that's exactly like that. And you all know it. There's this music that comes on. It's iconic for Law and Order. Ding, ding. You hear that sound, and you know it's Law and Order. You know it. And then the first thing that happened is there's this terrible crime, and somebody's screaming their head off. Oh, my gosh, look at the dead body. And then the crime-solving team, jumps up there. Okay, just the facts, what's going on. And you go through the investigation. And then the lawyers take over. And after an hour, the bad guy goes to jail. Rarely, but occasionally they'll let somebody go. They can't solve it or whatever. Or the bad guy ran off to another country or committed suicide or whatever. But in Dragnet, they always got their man. They always got their man. The Lone Ranger, and there he is, Jay Silverhills and Clayton Moore. Clayton Moore was the Lone Ranger. Jay Silverhills, the Tonto. Something to be going on, some woman to be screaming, and they'd show up, and silver bullets would be flying this way and that and the other, and bam, they would solve it. But all your problems are going to be solved in 30 minutes. Another one, and this is the one that really kicked it off, is the Milton Berle Show. Now, I mentioned this before, and I told you guys you're going to need it, now you do. Milton Berle came out of vaudeville. And if you need to take another look at what's going on with vaudeville, take another look at your notes. But as a reminder, it is these little short skits, high-energy skits. Now, the story goes that Milton Berle had to shoot before a live audience, and there was no tape delay. That's a later development. There's no tape delay. So whatever went on the stage, that's what everybody got in their homes. Milton Berle specialized in a sort of a vaudeville called, today we would call it drag. But, he was a cross-dresser back in those days as a comedy skit, as a comedy routine. Well, there was a very famous singer, and her name was Carmen Miranda. Look her up on YouTube. And Carmen Miranda, she was curvy. She was really beautiful. She always had this big hat, this headgear on with fruits and flowers, and it was really colorful. And she was a beautiful and really a really great singer. So there was the Milton Berle Show. It came on Wednesday at 7. And the curtains came back, and there was Milton Berle in drag, dressed up as a sort of send-up, a joke on Carmen Miranda. And, he had this big giant, this big giant chest on there, and he had, padding for his hips, and this huge giant fruit salad headgear on, and he started singing and dancing. And as, the song and dance went on, the thing that was on his head, this big giant wig and this big giant, fruit salad on his head, it got loose. He had to reach up there and grab it. And of course, the crowd's going crazy. It's hysterical. And then this thing that he had in his bra, whatever it was, this padding, it started going loose because he was doing this really exciting, singing and dancing. So he had to grab onto that. And right about that time, one of the falsies flew out and went rolling across the stage. And about that time, this big giant headpiece that he had on came unglued from his head, and it went flying into the, into the orchestra pit. And everybody was absolutely going crazy. What's important about this little story, ladies and gentlemen? After that show, everybody in America wanted a television. Everybody wanted a TV. Everybody. And this changes America. During the day, women are going to be watching soap operas. They're called soap operas because all the commercials were about soaps. Procter & Gamble. That's the big kahuna. They're going to be selling Windex. They're going to be selling Tide. They're going to be selling all this cleanup material because their target market is at home watching TV, and that's the wife. You know, vacuum cleaners, all the stuff to fix up the house. And so they would sponsor these soap operas. I have an example down there in the lower right, As the World Turns. From 1956, my hand to God, to 2010. That's how long this show ran. The soap opera. 13,858 episodes. And the target market were all these women who were at home, fixing food, cleaning the place up, taking care of the kids. Diapers and cleaning material and vacuum cleaners and whatever it is. Then at about 4 o'clock, the kids would get home from school. And so you get Howdy Doody and Buffalo Bob. And they would be selling, you know, sweet drinks or cereals or candy or something like that for the kids, toys. Then about 5 o'clock, 5:30, Dad would come home. And the first thing that would come on would be the news. Now, the news was only 15 minutes long in those early days of TV. And then right about 1961, 62, it turned to 30 minutes. So then it turned into an hour, and you had 30 minutes of local news and 30 minutes of national news. And then all night long, all evening long, you had adult programming. Dragnet, Milton Berle Show, The Twilight Zone. I think The Twilight Zone started in 1959, sure enough. And people got their favorites, and they would tune in. The Dick Van Dyke Show, The Danny Kaye Show, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, Phil Silvers, which is another variety show. I Love Lucy, just show after show after show after show, and they were all positive. Everything's going to be fine. That is the message. Here are all the products you need to buy and spend your money on. That is the message. There's no reason to go out there and dig a bomb shelter and curl up into a little ball. The sun will come up. And that's an extremely optimistic message, and that's what people wanted. So in our domestic policy, we're very, very optimistic. Let's go on to the next slide, and let me give you another example of this optimism. The automobile. All right, so again, let me put this into context. In the 1930s, the Great Depression was on, and people were very conservative in their buying habits. I've talked about that. Nobody wanted to buy a new car. They tried to make their old car last as long as it could. So, you know, until well into the 1930s, you could see a Model T still on the road. They were very robust, lots of parts for them. And then people started buying cars just a little bit, but then the war came along. In the 1940s, you could not buy a car, even if you wanted one. Because Ford and GM, Chrysler, they were all building tanks and Jeeps and trucks, bombers. So you couldn't even buy a car if you wanted to. So there for about, 15 years there, 18 years or so, no cars. Nobody bought a car. And you saw Model A's and Model B's on the road until well into the 1950s. But then the war was over with. And everybody was coming back from overseas. And manufacturing was going crazy. And Ford and Chevrolet, Chrysler, Hudson, Willis, Kaiser Willis, they started going right back into automobile production as fast as they could because the demand was almost unlimited. Now, for those of you guys who are watching this and who are car people, you know full well that when you take a look at these slides that you see here, on the pictures that you see here, that you're looking at today, in today's market, I don't know, $250,000 worth of cars easily. Just that some of the cars that are on there would run $250,000, so it might be a little bit higher than that. But let's just go through this real quick. You can get into a starter car. There in the upper left where I usually start, that's a starter car. It's called a shoebox. It's an unfortunate name for a car, but it's just basically square. A two-door sedan. Air conditioning, well, yeah. A 250 air conditioner. Roll down 2 windows and go 50 miles an hour. You got air conditioning. Very simple engine, straight six, very economical. Your first car after you got back from the war. Called a shoebox. Today, those are highly sought after because they were basically throwaways. But they had very clean lines. Well, you can take a look at it for yourself. If you wanted to be the sporty type, 1956, Chevrolet's going to come out with a small car called a Corvette. That's a 56 Corvette right there. 57 was the big year. The 56 that came out had a straight six, very small two-door coupe. Very fast. A designer came over from Chrysler, and his name was Carroll Shelby. Carroll Shelby. And he said, you know what? As it turns out, there's enough room under that hood to stuff in a V8. So they took a 327 Chevy and they stuck that in there. Holy smoke. Now those things run like a scalded dog, and they're very, very stylish, and everybody wanted one. You might be out there on the farm, you want something more robust. Okay, so Jeep, which had been building all these Jeeps all over the place, they said, okay, we'll start making pickups. They started making a sort of a van, but they're all-wheel drive, very economical. And so you get a Jeep pickup. That happens to be a 56. You kind of go down one, that red and black, that's a Chevrolet or a GM. This was the era of the fat fenders. Again, very, very economical. A straight six, robust, work great on the farm. They're still out there. Maybe you wanted a really economical car, and you'll get that little blue thing on the lower left. I put that slide in there for a reason, because there's a lot of cars that you guys have never even heard of today. The Japanese later on are going to drive them out of the marketplace. The Germans are going to drive them out of the marketplace with better economical cars. That happens to be a Nash Metropolitan. And Nash made cars that were so ugly they were cute. And Nash Metropolitans, as it turns out, they made a lot of them. You see them around, even today. And they're all over the place, if you know where to look. But they're very economical, a little four-cylinder engine, a four-on-the-floor transmission. If you got up to 50 miles an hour, you had to be going downhill. But they were really, really super economical, simple to maintain. Maybe you got a family, you want a station wagon. Okay, well, that's an Oldsmobile right there. And it was made, the part of the bodywork was made out of wood. What I'm driving at here, it's a throwaway. Have it for a couple of years. The wood's going to get all messed up because of the weather. The frame's going to get warped because it doesn't have enough lateral strength. And so you just like driving into a junkyard after your kids are all grown up. Well, now, an Oldsmobile Woody like that, they called them Woodies. I don't know, $70,000, $80,000. That'd be pretty cheap for a really, really well maintained or restored Woody. Again, maybe you want an economical, just straightforward car to get back and forth to work. That's a 57 Chevy Bel Air Convertible that you see down there in the lower left, that sky blue car. Talk about styling. Today, if you get a 57 Chevy Bel Air Convertible, if you can find one, and it's in that good of a shape, that happens to be an advertising photograph from the time, but if you find one in that kind of shape, you're $100,000. Up one, let's say you made it. Made a pile of money. You arrived when you could drive a Cadillac. That happens to be a Coupe de Ville. Got those big giant fins in the back. That means you know it's in the 1950s. This all is about the rocket age. All those big giant swoops, all those big giant dashes, those big huge tail fins, that's the rocket age. And this is Detroit rolling stock. I don't care even a little bit about that. Think of how many people got put back to work. Think of all the houses that were built in Levittown. Think of all the refrigerators, all the televisions that went into them. Now think about having a car. Think how much iron and steel goes into one of those things, copper. How many guys are designing those things and building them? They're cranking them out by the thousands because the demand is nearly unlimited. Nobody's been able to buy a car for 15 years. And now everybody wants a car. And then, you know, the timeless styling is evident. People still want those cars. I would kill to have some of those cars. Just amazing. So what was happening to the economy? Think of the optimism. Would you go get one of those cars if you thought you were going to die tomorrow? No, you get one of those cars. If it's not for conspicuous consumption, it's because you just need to get back and forth to work. You got to schlep the kids back and forth to school. You're by yourself, but you need something economical. So you're going to get one of those Nash Metropolitans or Cosmopolitan, or you're going to get a Corvette if you actually made it, but you're still by your onesie, or you're out there on the farm and you need a work truck. You're getting one of those Dodge or a Chevrolet. Dodge, they made power wagons. Awesome. Or a Jeep like you see up there, that GMC that you see right there in the middle. Inexpensive cars, inexpensive vehicles, but tough and economical. Well, so you got your car. What do you want to drive it on? What you're going to want to drive it on is something new in America, the interstate highway system. And the map shows it all, especially the blue. Strong note here. Strong note here. When Eisenhower had been in Europe, he had seen the German Autobahn. And it put kind of a little idea in the back of his head. And he said, listen, the Germans were using this Autobahn, and we were using it in 1945 as a mechanism to transport our guys around, and we did. And when Eisenhower became the president, he's like, listen, I'm going to take this Autobahn idea, and I'm going to apply it to America. Strong note. Up until that point, highways and road systems were basically a next generation wagon trail. It was ad hoc. Make it up as you go. This is where the wagons had gone, so we're going to put a road there. And then the road turned into a small highway, a farm to market or something like that. They were very ad hoc. That's all the red stuff that you see up there. It's just going wherever it is you happen to need it. And then it ends where you don't need it anymore. And a lot of roads were still dirt. But Eisenhower saw this as a military issue. He said, if we need a lot of tanks and jeeps and trucks on the West Coast, we got to have this highway system so we can just drive it out there and all the logistics to go with it. And if we have some trouble on the East Coast, we can just use this big, gigantic highway system to drive tanks and jeeps and trucks and logistics over to the East Coast or to the Gulf of Mexico or wherever it is we needed it. And so, think of all the designers making all those clover leaves. And clover leaves, that kind of middle photograph on the right there, or the I-10 interchange in downtown Los Angeles, that's down at the bottom, or a big giant, angle interchange that you see up there at the top. How many designers did it take to put that out there? How many guys out there laying the concrete, designing it, putting in the surveys, running in all the bridges, going around mountains or through them? The Eisenhower Tunnel runs 5 miles through the mountains. 5 miles, one tunnel. How many guys out there painting all those lines on all those highways? All the road signs. And what do they all do with the money they make? On top of all the guys building bombers, building an airline industry, building rocket ships so we can go to the moon, building cars, building houses. Think of the economy. It's extremely positive. Everybody's making a pile of money. And what do they all do with the money they made? They spent it. And somebody was there to meet their demands. Now, I want to be clear on something. Taxes were enormous. But because we had a gigantic middle class, we could pay for all that stuff. We could pay for the defense early warnings. We could pay for the space race. We could pay for everything because everybody was making a pile of money. It was an era of good feelings. It genuinely was. Our economy was going off like a Roman candle. No wonder we could give $13 billion, 1950s dollars to rebuild Europe. We could afford it. By the 1960s, we were absolutely rolling in money. Now, the Vietnam War is going to change all that. And the fact that the Germans and Japanese have rebuilt their economy, and now they've got their own output, it's going to change all that. But that's part of the turbulent 1960s. So let's go to the last slide, and that's effectively all I have to say about the 1950s. So from this presentation, I want you guys to go on to 1302, the turbulent 1960s, where the 1950s was a decade of duality. The 1960s is a decade of turbulence. Everybody uses that word when they talk about the 1960s. It's in your book. I'll talk about the Kennedy administration, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis. When we talk about all the stuff that went on in our foreign policy in the 1950s, that will be continued right into the turbulent 1960s. At one point, and I will talk about this, and you'll hear me basically jumping up and down when I do talk about it. We were within about 15 minutes of global thermonuclear warfare. Then, part of this turbulence is going to be assassination. Not just one or two or three, but several of them. JFK is going to get assassinated. MLK will get assassinated. RFK will get assassinated. Malcolm X is going to get assassinated. There's one after another, after another, after another. And controversies around every one of them is turbulence. LBJ and Great Society, I'll spend a lot of time on that. Civil rights, I have a presentation on that by itself. Vietnam, turbulent. I'll have a presentation on that by itself. Protests and civil rights, that characterized the 1960s. And then, last but not least, I have a presentation on Watergate. And that, in my view, represents an exclamation point at the end of the 1960s. So thank you for your time on the 1950s. This is the end of this presentation at an hour and 21 minutes. Go on and take a look at the turbulent 1960s. Thank you very much.